The conference room at Prairie Meridian Foods looked like every other conference room built in the last 10 years. Gray carpet, matte wood table, a wall screen that was too large for the room, and a tray of untouched coffee turning bitter by the minute. Cole Mercer had chosen that room for a reason. He wanted the setting to say control, process, confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from buying land from people who usually flinch when the first number gets big enough. Glenn Fisher did not flinch. Dana Fisher sat to his left with a yellow legal pad, a hard copy of parcel maps, and a folder tabbed in 4 places by year. Cole slid the revised purchase agreement across the table and pointed to the line that mattered, $19,800 per acre, 210 acres. Total consideration, $4,158,000. Cole kept talking as if movement alone could close the distance between paper and signature. He mentioned speed, certainty, and their internal deadline for regional protein processing capacity. He mentioned that this structure preserved the 30-acre home tract, barn lot, machine shed, and both grain bins outside the transfer boundary, terms Glenn had insisted on before anyone scheduled this meeting. He mentioned how rare it was to keep a deal this clean. The room heard the practiced cadence of someone who had closed dozens of tracks and expected one more. Dana asked one question about utility easement language on the western edge, page 22, section 14. Cole nodded, called legal, got a revision in 27 minutes, and printed fresh pages while everyone waited without small talk. The unusual part of the day was not the money, even at that number. The unusual part was the calendar. Prairie Meridian had first offered Glenn $13,500 per acre in 2019 for all 240 contiguous acres, a total of $3,240,000. Everyone in town had called that generous. A few called it crazy good. One banker called it life-changing and said it twice in the same conversation. Glenn had looked at the offer, folded it once, set it on the kitchen table, and said they needed to wait for one filing at the county level and one utility line that was already an engineering review. No speech, no posturing. He just declined. 5 years later, Cole Mercer was initialing corrected pages in a room that smelled like stale coffee, and the difference between what felt generous in 2019 and what existed in 2024 sat in black ink on page 1. The arithmetic was simple, and simple is often what makes people uncomfortable. 19,800 times 210, 4,158,000. Had Glenn accepted the first offer for the full 240, the gross would have been $3,240,000. The improvement created by waiting was $918,000, even after selling 30 fewer acres. Glenn signed where Dana pointed. Cole signed across from him. The county recorder received the packet at 3:17 that afternoon. To understand why a man would turn down what everyone called a winning number, the story has to leave that conference room and go back to a gravel lot in Greene County, Iowa, in 1986, where a 16-year-old stood near an auction trailer and learned what debt sounds like when it gets read out loud. The auctioneer had a voice built for distance and no time for softness. Glenn stood beside his father, cap in both hands, while his uncle's machinery lined up by age and value and sadness. 1 pass disc, 1 baler, 2 tractors, fuel tank, service truck, then house contents after lunch. Adults spoke in half sentences, because full sentences would have required naming what everyone already knew. His uncle had borrowed in years when grain prices looked stable, the notes penciled around optimistic yields and ordinary weather. Ordinary weather never arrived 2 seasons in a row. Interest kept accruing, operating credit tightened, and one bad production year became the year the bank set terms no family could meet in spring. Glenn watched a tractor worth far more than the bid go for less because nobody in that crowd could finance sentiment. His uncle did not rant, did not cry in public, did not blame anyone standing there. He stood near the fence and nodded at buyers he had known for 20 years. Glenn remembered the nods more than the prices. He remembered how quickly ownership changed hands once paperwork started, and how final it felt. The lesson did not arrive as philosophy. It arrived as sequence. Borrow to grow. Grow in ordinary years. Get hit once by weather, once by price, once by interest reset, then lose the right to choose your own timing. A 16-year-old did not have language for asymmetry and downside risk, but he had eyes, and that day gave him enough. He met Dana in community college bookkeeping class 7 years later, the least romantic setting for a durable marriage, and exactly the right one for their life. She could reconcile 3 accounts in her head and still remember whose birthday was next week. Glenn could rebuild a hydraulic line before daylight and explain every expense in terms of yield effect, repair horizon, and replacement window. They were not flashy together. They were coordinated. That matters more over 40 years than chemistry by itself. In 1994, they bought 80 acres for $96,000, 20% down, which meant $19,200 from savings and a loan of $76,800. The note ran 10 years, fixed at 8.25%, annual payment approximately $11,600 using the standard payment formula, and rounded to the nearest hundred. Glenn drove a truck already 12 years old. Dana kept envelopes labeled seed, fuel, repairs, taxes, reserve. They paid the note on schedule and added extra principal in 3 strong crop years. By 2004, the 80 acres were paid off in full, 10 years exactly. No refinance, no extension, no second lien. And the first decade looks quiet in hindsight, which is why people often miss where wealth gets built. Quiet years are where policy becomes habit, and habit becomes balance sheet. In 1995, cash corn averaged lower than they hoped, so they delayed pickup replacement and rebuilt the transmission for $1,800 instead of taking on a new payment. In 1996, a late spring shortened planting windows and yields slipped, so Dana cut household discretionary spending by 9% and still made the annual note payment in full. In 1997, a better harvest created surplus, and instead of adding machinery, they prepaid $3,000 of principal. In 1998, a major combine repair cost $9,400, and they funded it from reserve rather than operating credit. In 1999, Glenn bid on a used field cultivator at auction and got it for $6,300, less than half the dealer quote for newer equipment, because he arrived with cashier funds and no urgency. In 2000, they planted into drier soil conditions and bought crop insurance coverage that cut into margin. But the policy prevented a balance sheet hit when actual production came in lower than county trend. In 2001, basis widened after harvest, and their limited on-farm storage forced some grain to move at weaker prices, a frustration Glenn carried for years until the right investment window opened. In 2002, Dana began tracking maintenance cost per acre as a formal metric, not just receipts in a box, and that single discipline flagged 2 recurring machine issues early enough to avoid a larger failure in 2003. In 2003, they captured a favorable cash rent arrangement on a nearby 40-acre parcel for 1 season, a temporary step that raised gross income without new debt. In 2004, the original 80 acres note reached 0, And Glenn marked the ledger line with one word: finished. Debt-free land did not make them rich in 2004. Debt-free land made the next decision possible. Land prices had started moving, and by 2007 they saw a neighboring 160-acre tract come available at $3,200 per acre, total $512,000. People remember the price now and think it looked obvious. It did not. In 2007, that was still a large commitment for their scale. Glenn and Dana reviewed 10 years of records, projected conservative yields, stress-tested at lower commodity prices, and decided they could carry a 10-year note only if household spending stayed flat and reserve thresholds remained non-negotiable. They bought it. The financing structure mattered. They signed a 10-year fixed note that matched their planning horizon. No teaser period, no balloon at year 5, no variable reset. At 5.9%, annual payment on $512,000 was approximately $69,000 when rounded, and Dana wrote that figure on the first page of a new binder titled Land 2007 to 2017. That binder became their operating discipline for a decade. Every spring payment posted on time. 3 years included additional principal reduction after stronger cash receipts. They reached full payoff in 2017, exactly within the promised period, and by the date of payoff, they owned all 240 acres, contiguous and free of long-term debt. Ownership changed how Glenn moved through rooms where money gets discussed. Dealers assumed constraint when they saw his truck and jacket. Bankers assumed conservatism when he asked fewer questions than expected. Neighbors who upgraded frequently assumed he lacked appetite for growth. He rarely corrected anyone. He asked for terms when terms mattered and let assumptions drift when assumptions had no cost. The public version of Glenn was a careful operator who fixed things too long and worked too hard for too little appearance. The private version, known to Dana and 2 accountants and a stack of clean titles, was a business with low fixed obligations and optionality in bad years. Marty Vance farmed a few miles east and represented the path almost everyone called modern. Marty was competent, ambitious, and genuinely hardworking. He expanded acreage through leverage, updated equipment through finance packages, and negotiated hard for operating lines each winter. He was never reckless in personality. He simply believed scale would outrun debt service if he kept pushing. In ordinary years, that looked correct. New combines reduced downtime, larger planters covered acres faster, and photos of his operation in local farm media fed the impression that he had solved the growth equation. Glenn never mocked that approach. He knew exactly why smart people chose it. By 2019, Prairie Meridian Foods appeared in county records under shell entities, acquiring options near highway corridors, and rumor moved faster than public filings. Cole Mercer began meeting landowners quietly, offering control premiums for contiguous tracts close to future utility capacity. Glenn's 240 acres sat in a location that made industrial logistics efficient if one infrastructure piece lined up. Cole arrived with a first offer of $13,500 per acre for all 240 acres. Total $3,240,000. He framed it as immediate certainty against uncertain permitting timelines. He expected hesitation around emotional attachment and tax complexity. He did not expect a valuation argument from someone he had underestimated. Glenn listened, asked for the written proposal, asked for survey assumptions, and asked one question that changed the room: whether Prairie Meridian had modeled interchange approval probability above 60% if the county planning packet moved in the next cycle. Cole paused for half a beat. long enough to confirm Glenn had done his own work. Glenn did not counter with a new number. He declined and said timing was wrong. Cole left with polite frustration, reading the refusal as old-fashioned stubbornness. A few neighbors read it the same way because turning down $3,240,000 feels irrational when a man still patches coveralls. The refusal resolved one uncertainty and opened a larger one. Could Glenn afford to wait if the county process stalled and no second bidder came? Patience sounds wise until it has carrying cost. Waiting requires cash flow and reserves, not attitude. That is where Dana's books became the real story. Their records showed zero long-term debt after 2017, stable property tax coverage, and working capital sufficient to absorb weak years without forced sale pressure. Public assumption of unsophistication started cracking the first time a local lender saw those books during a routine discussion and realized Glenn had no mortgage payment at all on 240 acres. In 2020, the county approved an interchange plan and confirmed a 12-inch municipal water extension within 0.8 miles of Glenn's west boundary. Rachel Kim, county zoning attorney, handled public meetings with procedural clarity that frustrated rumor and rewarded paperwork. She never promised land values. She explained process, rights of way, hearing dates, and when utility corridor maps would become final enough for lenders and buyers to underwrite against. Glenn attended those meetings, sat in the back row, took notes, and left early to feed cattle. The filing he had waited for became real, not speculative. That approval still did not put money in his account. It created a window. Glenn used the window by strengthening the operation, while corporate timing matured. From 2021 through 2023, he and Dana put $286,000 into drain tile and on-farm storage upgrades, split as $198,000 for tile installation and $88,000 for bin and handling improvements. The spending was deliberate. Tile reduced yield volatility in wet years by improving field trafficability and root zone oxygen. Storage increased basis flexibility, allowing grain movement when local bids improved instead of at harvest lows. Net operating income rose because those two mechanics, yield stability and marketing timing, both shifted in their favor. Every dollar spent on upgrades carried a second rule: annual cash reserve could never fall below $420,000. They held that line each year. Reserve at year-end 2021 was $432,000. Reserve at year-end 2022 was $447,000. Reserve at year-end 2023 was $461,000. Holding those balances while funding improvements required discipline in household spending, machinery replacement timing, and grain marketing. It also required saying no to opportunities that looked good on paper but added complexity without sufficient return. Dana's phrase for it was simple: optionality is purchased in advance. Marty Vance faced the same weather, the same commodity swings, and the same interest rate environment, but his structure gave him less room to breathe. By 2022, his operating debt reached $1,870,000. That number did not mean he was careless. It meant thin margins under leverage had no cushion when fertilizer costs jumped and basis moved against expected cash flow. He restructured, converted short-term pressure into longer payments, sold 2 pieces of equipment below hoped value, and still could not regain enough flexibility to keep farming at prior scale. The restructure bought time and took options away at the same moment, because fixed payments still consumed cash when margins stayed thin. He exited active farming after restructuring and took an equipment service job that used his mechanical skill and kept his family insured. Glenn never spoke about Marty as a cautionary tale. He saw a neighbor who worked hard inside a framework that failed under stress. The contrast between Glenn and Marty sharpened every local conversation about risk, and those conversations rarely stayed fair. Some framed Glenn as lucky and Marty as overconfident. Reality was more nuanced. Marty's strategy optimized ordinary years and depended on continuity. Glenn's strategy accepted slower visible growth and protected against discontinuity. Agricultural markets deliver both kinds of years over career, and which years arrive when determines outcomes with brutal timing. Glenn had seen that timing once as a teenager and had built his life around never giving it leverage over his choices. By early 2024, Prairie Meridian faced schedule pressure on regional expansion, and schedule pressure changes negotiation behavior faster than philosophy ever does. Cole Mercer called Dana first, not Glenn. That alone showed who he now viewed as the keeper of terms. He asked whether they would entertain a revised proposal for a partial tract if boundary conditions preserved the home place. Dana said send maps, and no one would discuss numbers before legal descriptions were clean. Cole sent maps. Rachel Kim confirmed corridor assumptions and future access implications in writing. Title work began. The revised bid came in at $19,800 per acre for 210 acres. Total $4,158,000, with Glenn retaining the 30-acre home tract. Retained acreage included the house, machine shed, livestock lot, both upgraded grain bins, and enough tillable ground to keep active production under a new structure. Compared with the 2019 offer, the improvement from waiting was $918,000, calculated against gross sale totals, despite the smaller acreage sold. The arithmetic answered the question neighbors had been asking for 5 years, whether the original corporate interest was real or a pressure tactic. A second bid at materially higher terms, followed by signed purchase agreement and recorded transfer, confirmed genuine demand. Closing did not resolve identity pressure by itself. Selling 210 acres after a lifetime of building contiguous ownership can feel like betrayal to people whose sense of self is tied to acres controlled. Glenn handled that tension through structure, not slogans. He retained 30 acres and kept production active through a partnership model that widened access for someone younger. Lena Ortiz had been tenant farming on fragmented annual agreements and had the skill to run ground well, but lacked collateral to secure favorable operating terms through conventional channels. Glenn and Donna offered her a long-term lease on the retained tract with clear renewal language, conservation standards, and an operating note option from a private pool they were building out of sale proceeds. Lena's first lease term ran 10 years with rent, set below market peak, and indexed to commodity bands so one bad year would not break the agreement. Her operating note started at $120,000 at 3.25%, secured and documented, intended to cover seed, fertilizer, and early-season liquidity gaps. She still carried production risk, weather risk, and market risk like any farmer. The arrangement removed the most punitive financing pressure and gave her planning horizon long enough to improve soil and equipment decisions. The retained 30 acres stayed in active row crop rotation under her lease, using the same bins and yard Glenn had kept outside the sale line. Glenn had not preserved farming identity by clinging to every acre. He preserved it by keeping land in production and lowering entry barriers for the next operator. The money management in 2025 mattered as much as the sale itself, because windfall without structure leaks faster than people admit. After taxes and transaction fees, simplified for pacing in this account because exact liability varies by basis and filing detail. Glenn and Dana allocated net proceeds through 3 defined buckets tied to income durability and local impact. $1,200,000 went into municipal bonds with staggered maturities to provide stable tax-advantaged cash flow. $800,000 went into a diversified dividend fund targeting conservative distribution yield and liquidity. $300,000 was set aside as a documented operating note pool for beginning farmers in the county, including Lena's note and room for 2 additional borrowers over time. The first 2 buckets converted sale proceeds into steady income streams, and the third converted liquidity into local lending capacity they could control under written terms. They did not deploy every available dollar into those 3 buckets. Remaining post-sale liquidity stayed in reserve for retained farm operations, deferred maintenance, and flexibility around market cycles, the same logic that had guided them before the sale. Dana managed cash management policy with quarterly review dates, a minimum liquidity floor, and explicit conditions for issuing new notes from the beginner pool. Notes required security, documented repayment schedules, and production plans reviewed line by line. This was generosity with underwriting, which is the only kind that survives contact with reality. People who had watched Glenn for 30 years expected one visible consumption event after closing. New pickup, winter home, major remodel, something to signal arrival in the language the town understood. He replaced 1 grain auger motor, resurfaced the shop floor for safety, and kept driving the same truck for another season until transmission failure made replacement arithmetic sensible. When he did replace it, he paid cash for a used model with lower miles, because his rule had never been to avoid spending. His rule was to spend where ownership and utility aligned. That distinction had looked like thrift to outsiders for decades. It looked like freedom when interest rates rose and others were trapped in fixed payment ladders. Cole Mercer's resolution came quietly. After closing, he returned once more to walk right-of-way coordination with survey teams and thanked Glenn for a clean process. He admitted, in the careful language of someone revising his own assumptions, that he had misread Glenn in 2019. Glenn nodded and asked whether Prairie Meridian would honor drainage commitments along the transferred boundary during construction sequencing. Cole said yes and put it in writing. Respect in this story did not arrive through confrontation. It arrived through completed obligations and signed pages. Rachel Kim's role concluded with the same procedural clarity she had carried from the start. She confirmed rezoning conditions, utility corridor timing, and access language in county records so there would be no ambiguity for adjacent owners. Her work prevented half the disputes that usually poison these transitions. She never became a character in local rumor because paperwork done correctly leaves less oxygen for a rumor to burn. Glenn sent her office a handwritten thank you note with no flourish beyond 1 sentence. Clean records saved everyone time. Marty Vance's resolution took longer to stabilize. The first year out of active farming felt like grief disguised as exhaustion. He kept helping neighbors during harvest on weekends because muscle memory needs somewhere to go. The equipment job became steadier than he expected, and by 2025 he had paid down a meaningful portion of personal carryover debt and rebuilt family routines around predictable income. The cost of his restructure remained visible. Less control over timing, less room for error, and years of cash flow committed before new plans could start. He was still a farmer in knowledge and identity, even without control of acreage, and Glenn treated him that way, asking his advice on mechanical issues and paying for skilled labor when work was work. Sympathy in this town became practical when someone wrote a check for a neighbor's time and did not call it charity. Lena Ortiz's trajectory began proving itself by the second season of the lease. Stable tenure changed her planting decisions. She seeded a cover crop mix after harvest where annual tenants often skip because benefits arrive later than lease terms allow. She improved drainage in one low corner with Glenn's approval and cost-sharing from her operating note budget. Yield variability narrowed. Input timing improved. Her repayment schedule stayed current. She hired one part-time helper from town during planting and fall, which turned one private agreement into 2 paychecks and one more person learning production work at field level. The financial arc that looked dramatic from outside was built on arithmetic so plain it can sound boring until the outcomes arrive. In 1994, 80 acres purchased for $96,000 with $19,200 down and $76,800 financed, paid off by 2004. In 2007, 160 acres added at $3,200 per acre, $512,000 total, paid off by 2017. In 2019, first corporate offer at $13,500 per acre for all 240, total $3,240,000, declined. In 2020, interchange approval and 12-inch water extension within 0.8 miles changed the land's strategic value. In 2021 to 2023, $286,000 invested in tile and bins, while annual cash reserve stayed above $420,000. In 2024, final sale of 210 acres at $19,800 per acre, total $4,158,000, with 30 acres retained. Price improvement from waiting, $918,000. Those figures carry one more layer that matters. Glenn's patience in 2019 was credible, only because his books showed zero long-term debt and adequate reserves. If he had been stretched by note payments, refusal would have been theater. Because he was liquid and debt-free on the core asset, refusal was strategy grounded in capacity. Capacity changed the negotiation posture. It also changed his emotional posture, because urgency belonged to the buyer's expansion schedule, not his mortgage calendar. That reversal, who needs the deal sooner, determines price more often than rhetoric does. His relationship with disapproval stayed consistent across every phase. In the years when neighbors upgraded equipment through monthly packages and joked about his old truck, he kept maintenance logs and reserve targets. In the year he declined $3,240,000 and people called him stubborn, he watched county agendas and utility filings. In the years he spent $286,000 on tile and storage while waiting, he spent from strength and kept reserve above $420,000. In the year he sold for $4,158,000 and retained 30 acres, he did not hold court at coffee shops. He fixed a fence on the retained tract and checked grain moisture before dark. Dana Fisher's role is where many versions of this story would fail if told honestly, because discipline at this scale requires someone who can convert intention into systems. She kept records that made memory irrelevant, and memory is unreliable when stakes are high. She knew exactly when a payment schedule created hidden compression in spring cash flow. She tracked basis windows by elevator and date. She documented every reserve draw and repayment, every machine repair above threshold, every tax estimate update, every insurance adjustment after acreage changes. When Cole came back in 2024, he negotiated with both of them whether he intended to or not, because Dana's books removed ambiguity from every claim. The county saw a broader effect over the next year. Glenn and Dana's $300,000 operating note pool managed with underwriting standards instead of handshake optimism, financed Lena and prepared capacity for additional beginning operators who could not clear strict collateral bars at commercial rates. Bond coupons and dividend distributions started arriving on schedule, giving the household steady, non-farm income while leaving principal largely intact. Municipal bond income and dividend distributions stabilized household cash flow independent of crop swings, reducing pressure to over-rent or over-leverage retained operations. The retained 30 acres stayed active, productive, and visible as a working farm site through Lena's lease, not a ceremonial patch kept for nostalgia photos. Local continuity came from structure, not sentiment. Some stories in rural communities end at the reveal, the surprising balance sheet, the big check, the stunned room. This one kept moving because the reveal was never the point. The point was what the balance sheet allowed afterward. Choices made without panic, help extended without self-destruction, and identity preserved through use rather than display. Glenn did not become a different person after the sale. He became easier to read for people who insist on numbers before they revise assumptions. By late 2025, the roll call was clear. Glenn Fisher was debt-free, operating retained acreage through Lena Ortiz's long-term lease while keeping the home tracked and farm structures in active production, and overseeing a portfolio designed for durable income rather than spectacle. Dana Fisher co-managed investments and scholarship trust administration tied to local agricultural training pathways, extending their note pool logic into education support with formal criteria and annual reporting. Cole Mercer completed Prairie Meridian's land assembly on schedule and maintained drainage and access commitments in writing, preserving a professional relationship that began with misread assumptions and ended with clean execution. Rachel Kim had closed the zoning and corridor files with transparent documentation and no litigation spillover. Marty Vance had exited high-leverage farming, stabilized his family finances through equipment work, and remained part of the local production community through paid seasonal support. Lena Ortiz was farming under a 10-year lease on the retained tract, current on her operating note, and building equity in skill, soil, and reputation that annual tenancy rarely allows. The number of people still repeat in coffee shops is 918,000, the improvement created by waiting from 2019 to 2024. That number is accurate and useful, yet it leaves out the prerequisite. Waiting is expensive when debt clocks are running. Waiting is rational when obligations are low, reserves are real, and information is improving. Glenn did not reject the first offer because he enjoyed risk. He rejected it because one county filing and one utility corridor were likely to alter valuation, and his balance sheet could carry the interval without forced compromise. The market rewarded that patience. The market also punishes imitation without preparation, which is why Dana keeps saying the same thing when younger operators ask for the secret. There is no secret. There is only record-keeping, timing, and refusing obligations that remove your ability to choose. On an evening near harvest, Glenn stood by the retained bins while Lena's loaded wagon rolled in. Dust settled over the yard as scales beeped and augers started. Marty's pickup was parked near the shop because he had come over after work to help replace a sensor. Dana walked out with printouts for a quarterly review, and the stack included bond coupons, dividend statements, note amortization tables, and input budgets for the next crop year. No one in that yard looked like a headline. They looked like people doing the next task in front of them, with enough margin to choose the task on their own terms. The first offer in 2019 felt generous because it was generous relative to what the land had been, and it was still below what the land became once infrastructure certainty arrived. Glenn had spent 30 years building the one condition that lets a person wait for that distinction to become visible: ownership without long-term debt on the core asset. He turned down a number that impressed everyone in the room and accepted a better one 5 years later, under terms that preserved home ground and funded other people's starts. The correction happened without speeches. Arithmetic handled it.